The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a dull knife. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, staring at the digital calendar invitation that had just materialized on my monitor screen. It had popped up without warning, bearing a cold, clinical subject line, operations alignment discussion. The attendance was marked as mandatory, and it was scheduled to begin in exactly 30 minutes. I had exactly 30 minutes to prepare myself for a meeting that would inevitably change the course of my professional life. For 27 consecutive years, I had proudly served as the Senior Director of Global Operations at Summit Solutions. We were a highly specialized enterprise software development company based in Seattle, Washington, focusing almost exclusively on enterprise resource planning systems for massive manufacturing conglomerates. I had seen this company grow from a scrappy team of 12 people in a drafty warehouse to a global operation with hundreds of employees. I had dedicated my entire adult life to this company, starting as a junior operations analyst fresh out of graduate school in July of 998, having just completed my Master of Business Administration at the University of Washington. Back in those early days, I earned a modest annual salary of $54,600. I lived in a tiny, drafty studio apartment that somehow managed to consume more than half of my monthly net income, leaving me to survive on instant noodles and cheap black coffee. Through sheer hard work, late nights, and unyielding dedication, I steadily climbed the corporate ladder. By October, my annual compensation package had reached $249,600. This was complemented by substantial quarterly performance bonuses, comprehensive medical coverage, and a significant portfolio of stock options that I had accumulated over nearly 3 decades. I was responsible for managing a complex department comprised of 53 software professionals spread across 3 different continents. My division alone was directly responsible for generating $82 million in annual recurring revenue. I was not just another cog in the corporate machine. I was the person who had built the machine from the ground up. I was the living, breathing archive of institutional knowledge that kept Summit Solutions functioning on a daily basis. Whenever the chief executive officer forgot the historical details of a major client contract during a high-stakes negotiation, my phone was the one that rang. Whenever the finance department needed to retrieve legacy billing data from 999 that existed nowhere in our modern digital systems, they came to me. Whenever the board members demanded to know why a specific operational process was structured the way it was, I was the only one who could provide a comprehensive and satisfying answer. My personal email archive stretched back for 27 years, documenting the entire evolution of our software products. I had cultivated and maintained fragile vendor relationships that predated the employment of almost the entire current executive team. For nearly 3 decades, I was absolutely indispensable. Then, without warning, the corporate landscape shifted beneath my feet. The problems officially began 8 months prior, in February, when Summit Solutions was formally acquired by Vanguard Global Enterprises, a massive, faceless conglomerate valued at roughly $14.8 billion. Vanguard was notorious in the technology sector. Their business model was simple and brutal. They purchased successful, profitable mid-sized companies, systematically eliminated their most experienced and expensive employees, and immediately replaced them with recent college graduates who would eagerly accept far lower salaries without ever questioning the decisions of their superiors. I had personally watched this predatory playbook destroy 3 of our primary competitors in the enterprise software space over the preceding 22 months. I knew exactly what was coming. The corporate acquisition script never varied. First, the new management team would arrive wearing expensive tailored suits, making sweeping, reassuring promises about stability, synergy, and operational continuity. They would look us in the eyes and tell us how valuable our experience was. Then, slowly but surely, they would begin systematically targeting anyone earning over $160,000 annually. They would replace them with fresh, naive graduates making $88,000 who simply did not possess the industry experience to realize they were being exploited. The acquisition was officially finalized on February 14th, Valentine's Day. I found the timing to be a dark, ironic joke. The brand new management team arrived on February 22nd, marching into our glass-walled lobby like a conquering army. Our new chief executive officer was Bradley Mercer. He was 39 years old, boasted an Ivy League degree, and had previously run a flashy startup that had burned through $50 million in venture capital before collapsing spectacularly into bankruptcy. Despite his credentials on paper, Bradley possessed absolutely zero practical, hands-on experience in the complex details of software operations. The new chief financial officer was Matthew Thorne, a 38-year-old former senior consultant from a massive management consulting firm. Matthew was brilliant with spreadsheets and financial modeling, but he was completely detached from how a real business functioned on a daily basis. The new chief operating officer was Zachary Reed, 41 years old, who had been a vice president at Vanguard Global for exactly 22 months. Zachary genuinely believed he knew everything there was to know about software development because he had once managed a tiny, failing subsidiary for 10 months before it was quietly liquidated. They immediately scheduled a mandatory company-wide town hall meeting for March 3rd, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Bradley stood confidently at the front of the main conference room, a space I had personally helped design when we relocated to this modern building over a decade ago. I had spent weeks selecting the ergonomic furniture, negotiating the audiovisual contracts, and even choosing the specific shade of slate gray paint for the soundproof walls. Bradley delivered the standard predictable corporate speech. He projected a rehearsed enthusiasm that fooled absolutely nobody who had spent more than a year in the corporate world. He assured us that Vanguard valued our unique culture, and that our positions were completely secure. I went home that evening, poured a glass of red wine, and updated my resume. But I also started doing something else, something my grandfather, who had spent 35 years as a tough labor union representative, had taught me. I started documenting absolutely everything. I began keeping a meticulous record of every single interaction, every email exchange, every newly implemented process, and every casual conversation that seemed even remotely significant. I systematically backed up my documentation to 3 separate, heavily encrypted external hard drives that I kept hidden safely at home, utilizing military-grade encryption software. I had learned this crucial lesson from watching the corporate world devour talented people. When they decide to fire you, they do it suddenly. They lock you out of your email and internal systems before you can even stand up from your desk, leaving you with absolutely zero proof of your accomplishments or the promises they made you. I refused to let myself be left defenseless. The systematic purge began in March, exactly 4 weeks after the acquisition closed. On March 24th at 8 o'clock in the morning, they unceremoniously terminated 19 employees. Every single one of them was over 46 years old. Every single one of them earned more than $140,000 annually. And every single one of them possessed multiple decades of irreplaceable institutional knowledge. Among them was Harold, our lead database administrator, who had been with us for 22 years, and Walter, the head of client services, who had built our customer base from scratch. They were quickly replaced within 6 weeks by cheap, young graduates who earned less than half of their salaries. The new hires were completely lost, stumbling through tasks and creating critical system errors. Brandon, a 29-year-old manager who had been with the company for only 11 months, tried to cover up the mistakes, but failed. I was often asked to silently fix their errors behind the scenes, which I did, while documenting every single incident. The Human Resources Department, led by Beatrice Jenkins, referred to this mass firing as a strategic organizational realignment. I referred to it as systematic age discrimination, but I kept my observations entirely to myself, quietly recording every termination, every replacement hire, and every closed-door meeting where employee age or compensation was discussed. By April, the executives began targeting me. It started with small, insidious exclusions. I was suddenly left off the invite lists for high-level planning sessions that I had facilitated for years. On April 18th, There was an important quarterly strategic planning meeting that I had run for 11 consecutive years. My digital calendar invitation was abruptly canceled without a word of explanation. When I walked to Bradley's office to ask him about it, he did not even look up from his phone. He adjusted his glasses, checked his smartwatch, and gave me a practiced, dismissive smile, saying they were simply bringing fresh, modern perspectives to the process and appreciated my past contributions. On April 29th, they reassigned 4 of my most critical operational responsibilities to Brandon. These responsibilities included overseeing database architectures and managing service-level agreements with our largest clients. Brandon possessed no understanding of our legacy codebase or the complex vendor contracts I had spent decades maintaining. He was completely out of his depth, nervously laughing during meetings and attempting to copy my architectural files. On May 15th, during a department-wide meeting with my entire team present, Zachary Reed openly questioned my strategic decision-making. He heavily implied that I was out of touch with contemporary software deployment strategies. The room went completely silent. Several of my team members looked down at the table, while others looked at me with deep sympathy. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic designed to humiliate me into resigning, which would save them from paying a severance package. I took a deep breath, maintained my composure, and refused to give them the satisfaction of quitting. I showed up every single day, performed my duties flawlessly, and silently documented every single insult, every exclusion, and every instance of disrespect. My official human resources file was spotless. I had 27 years of glowing performance reviews, 0 disciplinary actions, and multiple leadership awards. They knew they could not fire me for cause, and they absolutely hated it. On June 27th, they tried a different approach to force me out. Matthew Thorne, the chief financial officer, called me into his spacious corner office at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Friday meetings at that hour are always bad news. The rain was pouring heavily against the glass windows, matching the gloomy mood of the office. Matthew adjusted his expensive tie, looked out at the Seattle skyline, and told me they were restructuring the operations department. He informed me that my current position was being permanently eliminated. In its place, they were creating a new role called Senior Operations Coordinator. He said I was welcome to apply for it, but the salary would be reduced to $122,200. This was a massive pay cut for what was essentially the exact same job under a lesser title. It was a textbook case of constructive dismissal. I smiled politely, showed no emotion, and told Matthew that I would need some time to consider the offer. I immediately went home and called Evelyn Rossi, a fierce employment attorney whom I had quietly retained back in April when the warning signs became too loud to ignore. Evelyn's office was wood-paneled and filled with thick law books, smelling of old paper and quiet confidence. She had 32 years of experience in employment law, specializing in wrongful termination and age discrimination. She had represented hundreds of employees against massive conglomerates and maintained an impressive 84% success rate. She charged $585 an hour, and I had already paid her $5,265 for 9 detailed consultations. Evelyn analyzed my documentation and told me to reject the demotion. She explained the legal definition of constructive dismissal under Washington state law and advised me to wait for their next move. I waited for exactly 38 days. On August 4th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the trap was finally sprung. I received an urgent email from Bradley's assistant requesting my presence in Conference Room C immediately. Conference Room C was a glass-walled room reserved for formal board meetings and official corporate transactions. I calmly retrieved the printed resignation letter that Evelyn and I had drafted weeks prior, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I then walked down the hallway, maintaining a steady, relaxed pace. I could hear the faint click of keyboards and the hushed whispers of my coworkers as I walked past their cubicles. As I walked, my mind drifted back to the history of this floor. I remembered when we first moved into this building 12 years ago. I had personally volunteered to spend a weekend, helping the local painting crew apply that specific calming shade of slate gray to the soundproof walls of Conference Room C. I had painted alongside a senior operations manager who had since retired comfortably on his pension. That memory reminded me of a time when Summit Solutions valued its people, a sharp and painful contrast to the cold corporate machinery waiting for me inside. When I entered the room, I found Bradley Matthew, Zachary, and Beatrice Jenkins already seated on one side of the long mahogany table. They looked like a panel of judges preparing to pass sentence on a prisoner. In front of each of them was an expensive leather folder, a silver pen, and an expression of rehearsed corporate sympathy. Bradley pointed to the single chair on the opposite side of the table. I sat down looking at each of them in turn. I had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, and I was completely prepared. Bradley began speaking with a forced tone of friendliness, explaining that after careful consideration, they had decided to eliminate the Global Operations Director role to align with Vanguard's structure. He was formally telling me that my services were no longer required. He claimed that this decision was entirely driven by strategic alignment and capital efficiency, utilizing empty corporate buzzwords to gloss over the blatant unfairness of the act. Matthew then took over, sliding a thick manila folder across the table toward me. He explained that they had prepared two options for me. Option 1 was voluntary resignation. If I signed their pre-written resignation document immediately, they would provide me with 4 weeks of severance pay, which amounted to $14,400, along with my accrued vacation time. They would also provide a neutral employment reference. Matthew emphasized that this was a clean break that would allow me to leave with my dignity intact. Beatrice Jenkins chimed in, reading from her HR handbook, detailing how the company would handle my healthcare transition and offboarding process as if it were a routine minor administrative task. 4 weeks of severance after 27 years of loyal service was an absolute insult. Washington state law did not mandate severance packages, and they were counting on my fear to force me into signing. Option 2, Zachary added with a smug smile, was immediate termination. If I refused to resign, they would fire me on the spot for redundancy. I would receive 0 severance, 0 vacation payout, and they would note in my file that my position was eliminated due to redundancy. Zachary warned me that if I did not cooperate, they would ensure my name was flagged in Vanguard's global recruitment databases, making it nearly impossible for me to secure a senior operational position anywhere in the Pacific Northwest software industry. It was a blatant threat designed to coerce me into signing away my rights. They were telling me that if I did not take their tiny offer, they would intentionally ruin my reputation. I opened their folder and read the document. It was a standard corporate release. By signing it, I would be resigning voluntarily and agreeing to waive all future legal claims against Summit Solutions and Vanguard Global Enterprises in exchange for the $14,400. I looked at the executives. Bradley was checking his watch, probably thinking about his dinner plans. Matthew had a slight smirk. They were entirely confident that they had trapped me. I thought about my grandfather, who had fought for workers' rights his entire life. He had spent 35 years as a construction foreman, fighting for safety regulations and fair wages in Seattle's shipping yards. He had proudly stood on the picket lines during the freezing winter strikes of 1974, enduring economic hardship to secure basic protections for his crew. He had always told me to never sign anything under pressure, and to never let corporate bullies wearing expensive suits intimidate me. He taught me that working people have fundamental rights, and that we must stand up for ourselves when greedy managers try to steal what we have earned. I possessed the evidence of their age discrimination, and I possessed the law. I looked Bradley in the eyes. I told them that I would resign, but that I refused to sign their document. I stated that I would write my own resignation letter. The executives looked surprised. Matthew stammered that their document covered all legal requirements, but I repeated my demand. I asked them if they were planning to dictate the exact words I was allowed to use in my personal resignation letter. Bradley hesitated, realizing that forcing me to sign their template would look highly coercive in a courtroom. He agreed, but demanded that the letter be delivered to Human Resources by 5 o'clock that afternoon. I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving them with their unsigned papers and their false sense of victory. I returned to my office, locked the heavy wooden door, and opened my laptop. I did not need to draft a new letter. Evelyn and I had already spent 6 hours perfecting a single 42-word sentence weeks ago during our detailed consultations. Evelyn had thoroughly explained the Washington state case law surrounding conditional contracts. She explained how the courts enforce conditions, precedent in written agreements, and we debated every single word to ensure there was no ambiguity. The key phrase was, effective upon receipt of complete settlement. We wanted to ensure that if the company accepted the resignation, they were legally bound to fulfill the condition before the resignation could take effect. I printed the letter on official company stationery, signed it in blue ink, and made 4 copies. At exactly 4 o'clock, I walked back to conference room C and handed the document to Bradley. The letter read, I, Ronald Vance, hereby resign from my position as Senior Director of Global Operations at Summit Solutions, effective upon receipt of complete settlement of all compensation legally owed to me under my employment agreement and applicable Washington state law. Bradley read the single sentence quickly, shrugged, and handed it to Beatrice Jenkins. He told me that Human Resources would process the resignation and that my final check would be mailed to me. I stood my ground and demanded that they explicitly document all components of my final compensation, including the exact financial figures and the payment timeline. Matthew sighed and rolled his eyes, stating that I would receive the 4 weeks of severance, which was $14,400. Beatrice confirmed that my accrued vacation time of 185 hours would also be paid out. I also reminded them of my outstanding approved travel and operational expense reimbursements. Zachary told me that everything would be processed and ordered me to leave the premises. I walked back to my office to pack my personal belongings. I spent about 45 minutes placing my items into 3 sturdy cardboard boxes, carefully wrapping the fragile items in sheets of packing paper I had brought from home. I packed a framed photograph of my late wife, a ceramic mug I had received for my 10th anniversary at the company, and several personal notebooks containing decades of calculations and architectural ideas. I also packed several plaques from the walls, including my Operations Excellence Award from 2017 and my Leadership Innovation Award from 2019. It was a deeply emotional process, realizing that 27 years of my hard work and life was being packed into 3 boxes. As I carried the boxes down the hall, a junior software developer named Sean looked up from his desk. He looked shocked to see me carrying the boxes. He slowly rose and walked over to me, whispering quietly so the managers would not hear. He asked me if they had actually fired me and where I was going. I looked at his worried face and gave him a reassuring nod. I whispered back, telling him to not worry, to keep his head down, and to keep coding, as they would soon realize my value. Sean looked completely bewildered, but he nodded and returned to his desk. When I reached the lobby, the security guard on duty, a friendly older man named Roy, who had worked at the front desk for 15 years, rushed over to help me. Roy expressed his deep shock and sadness, stating that the office would not be the same without me. He thanked me for the kindness I had shown him over the years, especially when my department had supported his family during a difficult time. I thanked Roy, shook his hand warmly, and stepped out into the Seattle rain. I placed the heavy boxes in the trunk of my sedan, started the engine, and listened to the rain drum heavily on the windshield. I watched the wipers click back and forth, feeling a sudden, unexpected wave of relief wash over me. I drove home through the slow Seattle traffic, looking up at the office tower in my rearview mirror, and felt a quiet, absolute confidence in our strategy. Once home, I set the boxes in my living room, poured a glass of wine, and waited. I knew they would not analyze the letter immediately. They were too arrogant, too focused on their victory, and too eager to clear out my office. They simply filed the paper and assumed I was gone. For 5 days, I maintained absolute radio silence. I did not log into any company networks, I did not answer calls from coworkers, and I did not send any emails. I let them enjoy their weekend and their quiet Monday, knowing that they were probably celebrating their perceived cost savings. I knew that the wheels of corporate bureaucracy moved slowly, but once the legal department got a copy of my resignation letter, the panic would set in. I spent my time gardening, pruning my rose bushes, watching the large cargo ships navigate Puget Sound, and taking long, reflective walks along Alki Beach to clear my mind and keep my anxiety at bay. I listened to the phone ring on the kitchen counter, letting it vibrate against the wood without ever picking it up. My screen lit up with frantic text messages from Matthew Thorne, asking for database administrative passwords, and Beatrice Jenkins asking for my mailing address. But I ignored them all. I was completely prepared for the phone call when it finally arrived. On Tuesday morning at exactly 7 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of Nicholas Sullivan, the General Counsel for Vanguard Global Enterprises. I took a slow sip of my coffee, answered the call, and greeted him politely. Nicholas's voice was tight and filled with tension. He tried to start the conversation with a forced tone of warmth, asking how I was enjoying my retirement, before quickly transitioning into the legal matter. He told me that there was significant confusion regarding the wording of my resignation letters, specifically the phrase, stating that my resignation was effective upon receipt of complete settlement of all compensation legally owed. I explained the situation to him calmly, as if I were explaining a simple database structure to a junior analyst. I told him that under Washington state law, a conditional resignation is entirely valid, because my resignation was explicitly conditioned upon the complete settlement of all compensation owed to me, and because they had not yet paid me those funds, my resignation had not actually taken effect. This meant that I was still technically an active employee of Summit Solutions, accruing my daily salary and remaining entitled to all company benefits. Nicholas tried to argue that the board had accepted the resignation, making it final. I countered by explaining that, by accepting a conditional resignation letter, they had legally accepted the conditions attached to it. Nicholas was silent for a long moment before asking what compensation I believed I was owed. I opened my laptop and read the figures from my spreadsheet. I broke it down for him. First, my base salary running through the actual date my resignation becomes effective, which was $19,200. Second, my accrued unused vacation time, which came to $22,200. Nicholas disputed this, claiming their systems showed only 40 hours. But I cited the specific HR timesheets and corporate policies that I had backed up. Third, my outstanding approved expense reimbursements of $5,573. These three basic items totaled $46,973. I then informed him that this was only the beginning. Nicholas's voice rose in pitch as he asked what else I could possibly claim. I listed the major items. Fourth, my annual performance bonus of $199,600, which had been fully earned but not yet paid. Fifth, my vested stock options. Under the acquisition agreement, all of my 67,600 stock options vested immediately upon a change of corporate control, making them worth $1,948,908. Nicholas gasped, claiming those options were supposed to have been canceled upon my departure, but I directed him to the merger agreement's change of control clause. Sixth, my contractual severance package. My original employment agreement, signed 27 years ago, contained a clause stating that if my position was eliminated due to corporate restructuring, I was entitled to a severance package of 2 years base salary plus health insurance. Premiums. This amounted to $548,000 in salary and $40,950 in premiums. Nicholas gasped, stating that I was claiming they owed me over $2,700,000. I corrected him, stating the exact figure, $2,777,311, plus interest accruing daily. I reminded him that because my resignation had not yet taken effect, the total was increasing every single day. He argued that they would never pay such a sum for an old contract from 27 years ago. I reminded him that Vanguard had assumed all existing contracts and liabilities during the acquisition, and they had failed to perform their due diligence. I explained that under Washington law, when an employee is constructively discharged, the employer has breached the contract, triggering any change of control or severance provisions. Since my resignation was conditional and not yet effective, the employer's elimination of my position constituted a direct breach, which triggered the severance clause in full. He yelled that this was absurd and that they would fight it in court. I calmly told him that they were welcome to do so, and that my attorney was prepared to file a lawsuit for age discrimination, backed by 27 years of documented evidence showing the systematic termination of older employees. I told him I had backups of all communications on secure external drives. Nicholas slammed the phone down, but he called me back that evening at 6 o'clock. His tone had completely changed. He offered a settlement of $1,500,000 to resolve the matter. I rejected the offer immediately. I told him that I would only accept the full amount of $2,777,311, plus my attorney's fees of $82,485 to be paid via wire transfer within 20 business days. He called me back at 8 o'clock that night to accept the terms. On September 3rd, I logged into my bank portal and verified that my account balance had increased by $2,859,796. The wire transfer had cleared in full. I felt a deep sense of relief and quiet triumph. I immediately called Evelyn Rossi to confirm the receipt of the funds and thank her for her fierce support. The executives who had tried to humiliate me and steal my severance had been defeated by their own arrogance and a single sentence. I retired comfortably, knowing that justice had been served and that dignity could not be bought, but it could certainly be defended by the strength of the law.